When we talk about human heart blood flow, we begin our journey from the inferior and superior vena cava. Now we can see over here that the inferior vena cava is located at the bottom of the heart, therefore it is labeled inferior, which means low or below. Now the inferior vena cava is going to bring the deoxygenated blood from the lower part of the body and dispense it into the right atrium. Now the superior vena cava, it is superior meaning it is on top. It will bring the deoxygenated blood from the upper portion of the body, for example, from the brain. And it will also dispense the deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. Now, when we compare the right atrium to the right ventricle, the right atrium has a more thin musculature in comparison to the right ventricle, which will be more muscular, and we'll see why in a second. So once the two vena cavas dispense that deoxygenated blood in the right atrium, that blood will move then from the right atrium to the right ventricle. And in order to go from that atrium to that ventricle, it has to pass through this valve over here. This valve is known as the right atrioventricular valve or the tricuspid valve. It's the tricuspid, meaning three cuspid. Three cuspid simply means it has three cusps or three flaps. So this valve must open in order for blood to pass through into the right ventricle. Now, what's very interesting to note about this valve is that it is shaped in this inward style. And there's a specific reasoning for its shape. And that reason is to prevent backflow of blood from right ventricle to right atrium. So remember that we want blood to move in this direction. We do not want blood to move in the opposite direction. Now we can imagine that if the blood pushes against this valve over here, it's going to further keep the valve closed because of this curvature. But on this side, if we were to push blood against here, this would cause the valve to open because over here, the valve is curved in, but here it's sticking out. So the anatomy of this valve is very important to prevent backflow of blood back into the right atrium. So now that we are in the right ventricle is a lot more muscular in comparison to the right atrium because the right ventricle is responsible for pumping blood out. And in order to pump blood out, it needs to be a more muscular part of the heart. Whereas the right atrium, it's simply a collecting area of blood. So when this right ventricle, it pushes blood out, it's going to push blood out through the pulmonary semilunar valve. Now, the pulmonary semilunar valve also has three cusps. And it will pass through into the pulmonary artery. And we can remember that this is the pulmonary semilunar valve because it's now going to enter the pulmonary artery. And that pulmonary artery is going to go to the lungs. And that deoxygenated blood is going to become oxygenated within the lungs. Now, one quick thing that I also want to mention here is that normally in biology textbooks, whenever we think of an artery or whenever we think of a vein, we denote artery with red blood or oxygenated blood, whereas a vein is denoted with deoxygenated blood or blue blood. This isn't true because in reality, whether it's deoxygenated or oxygenated blood, that does not matter. What matters is the direction of blood flow. So by definition, an artery moves blood away from the heart, but a vein moves blood towards the heart. And in this case of human heart blood flow, when that right ventricle pushes the deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary artery, that pulmonary artery is carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. And once the lungs reoxygenate that blood will move back to the heart through the pulmonary vein. So when the blood is going away from the heart, it's an artery, and when we're moving towards the heart, it's a vein. So once that blood is reoxygenated from the lungs, it comes back through the pulmonary vein, and once again we see the blood dispensing in the atrium. But this time it will be the left atrium. And now once again, the blood has to move from left atrium to left ventricle. And in order to do that, it must pass through another opening. And that opening is known as our left atrioventricular valve, or the mitral valve. And the mitral valve is actually a bicuspid. So that means it has two flasps or two cusps. So if we compare the two atrioventricular valves that we have learned about, over here we had 3 cusps, and over here we have 2 cusps. And it's the same thing. We're moving from atrium to ventricle. Now, the ventricle over here, the left ventricle, it has the most thickest musculature out of all the spaces in the heart. So this left ventricle has more of a thick musculature in comparison to that right ventricle, because this left ventricle is going to be pumping blood into the aorta, and the aorta is the largest artery in the body, and it is responsible for pushing all that blood out into our body. So it makes sense that this left ventricle has to push out a lot of blood into that artery. Now, when the left ventricle pushes that blood out into the aorta, it passes through another valve, and this valve is known as the aortic semilunar valve. Now, once it enters the aorta simply pumps that blood out into the body. Now, quickly going back to the different types of valves we've learned about, there are 2 categories of valves within our heart. We have the atrioventricular valves, which connect atrium and ventricle, and it is in the name. So atrio is for atrium and ventricular is for ventricle. And then we also have the 2 semilunar valves, and the semilunar valves are defined by the area in which they are located. So the pulmonary semilunar valve is allowing blood flow into the pulmonary artery, whereas the aortic semilunar valve is allowing blood flow into the aorta. Now, the last thing to mention, once again, is that over here we see a tricuspid valve. This is also a tricuspid valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve, and the aortic semilunar valve is also tricuspid, but this mitral valve, or the left atrioventricular valve, is a bicuspid. Now, to quickly overview, we have deoxygenated blood entering the right atrium. From right atrium, we move through the right atrioventricular valve, or the tricuspid, into the right ventricle. Through the right ventricle, we move through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary artery, which is going to be carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. And then the oxygenated blood from the lungs is going to come back through the pulmonary vein and into the left atrium. It's going to move through that bicuspid, or left atrioventricular valve, into that left ventricle. That left ventricle is going to push all that blood out through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta, where the aorta will pump all of that blood out into the body. And that is essentially human heart blood flow.